Welcome. I am Ms.N.S.Lavanya, Assistant Professor, Department of English, KCS Kasinadar College of Arts and Science. In this video, I am going to summarize Cato, a tragedy written by Joseph Addison. It's a play written in 1712 and performed on 14 April 1713. The story is based on the events of the last days of Marcus Porcius Cato Uticensis, a Stoic whose deeds, rhetoric, and resistance to the tyranny of Julius Caesar made him an icon of republicanism, virtue, and liberty. During the final years of Caesar's civil war, the remnants of the Roman Senate, led by Cato the Younger, have fled from Caesar's legions to Utica, Tunisia. In Cato's court are his twin sons Marcus and Porcius, his daughter Marcia, the exiled Numidian prince Juba, an ally of Cato, whose father Scipio Caesar killed in the battle of Thapsus, Juba's servant Syphax, and the senior senators Sempronius and Lucius. The play opens as Marcus and Porcius praise their father's bravery and reassure one another that he will prevail over Caesar. The senator Sempronius arrives and pretends to agree with them, but reveals to the audience that he resents Cato for refusing his request to marry Marcia and plans to betray him to Caesar in exchange for Marcia's hand. Sempronius persuades Syphax to join his cause and urges him to persuade Juba to marshal the Numidian armies he has brought to Utica and overthrow Cato. Syphax goes to Juba and tries to turn him against Cato, but Juba rebuffs him and says Cato is like a second father to him and that he is in love with Marcia and wants Cato's favor to marry her. Syphax complains that Juba's idolatry of Cato and Marcia have blinded him to reasonable advice and leaves. Juba finds Marcia cavorting with her friend Lucia and flirts with her, but she scolds him for being distracted by romantic fantasies during a dire crisis. He apologizes and leaves to tend to his Numidian armies, resolving to try to win her over later. Lucia chides Marcia for spurning the advances of the rich and handsome prince and confesses that she is in love with Porcius and that they are eloping. Marcia sympathizes with her but warns her that Marcus loves her as well and his jealousy will drive the brothers apart forever if he finds out. She beseeches Lucia to hold her tongue until the war is won, lest she create more chaos in Cato's house. The two ladies leave the place. In the Senate house at Utica, Cato calls a meeting of the few remaining Roman senators and asks for a plan to defeat the rapidly advancing Caesar. Sempronius calls for war, arguing that it is time for Rome to avenge the deaths of Scipio and others with fire and fury. Lucius pleads for peace and states that enough blood has been needlessly shed and that it is time for Rome to yield to Caesar. Cato states that both are half right but also half wrong and explains that the best course of action is neither too reckless nor too cowardly. He declares that he will continue to fight until Caesar reaches Utica and only then sue for peace. An envoy from Caesar's camp arrives and informs Cato that Caesar has agreed to spare his life if he surrenders Utica immediately. Cato retorts that he will be merciful enough to spare Caesar's life if he surrenders now and stands trial in the Senate and then sends the envoy away. Juba arrives and praises Cato's strong leadership prompting Cato to express gratitude for Juba's loyalty. Cato promises to give Juba whatever he wants as repayment for his service when the war ends. Juba shyly asks to wed Marcia, but Cato is affronted by the notion of Marcia marrying a Numidian and storms off. Syphax arrives and Juba laments that Cato will not consent for him to marry Marcia. Syphax once again urges Juba to marshal the Numidian armies and overthrow Cato, and suggests that once Cato is dead, he can take Marcia as his prize. But Juba vows that he will remain an honorable man and win Cato's favor fairly to marry Marcia. Syphax worries that Juba will never turn against Cato. Marcus, still unaware of Porcius and Lucia's affair, comes to Porcius and begs him to convince Lucia to wed him. Porcius informs Lucia how much grief Marcus is in because of his love for her, and saddened by this news, she decides to end their affair before it brings any more misfortune to Cato's already suffering family. Porcius tells Marcus that Lucia feels compassion for him but has sworn of love and cannot be with him, and a grieving Marcus pledges that if Lucia will not be his, he will die for fighting his father's enemies rather than live without her. In the Senate, Sempronius grows tired of waiting for Syphax to turn Juba's allegiances and raises his own mutinous legion to overthrow Cato. He sends them to arrest Cato, but when Cato is confronted, he makes an impassioned speech that moves them to release him. Sempronius realizes Cato cannot be deposed by troops so loyal to him and resolves to abandon his plot, abscond with Marcia and leave Utica to join Caesar's legions. He dresses as Juba to gain entry to Marcia's apartments, but Juba himself finds him and kills him. Marcia finds Sempronius' body and, believing it to be Juba's by his dress, confesses tearfully that she truly loved Juba all along and weeps for his death. Juba hears that and reveals that he is still alive, and they embrace. Meanwhile, Syphax succeeds in marshalling the Numidian armies himself, but the reckless and self-destructive Marcus viciously attacks them and slays Syphax before being slain himself. Cato learns of all this and condemns Sempronius and Syphax while praising Marcus' bravery. He declares that instead of mourning his son, everyone ought to mourn the fallen Roman Republic which he died to protect, before he announces that he intends to surrender Utica to Caesar. Waiting for Caesar's legions to arrive, Cato privately ponders whether or not to fall on his sword before they do, and he laments that world was made for Caesar and not for virtuous men. He kills himself. Before he dies, he is discovered by a shocked Marcia and Porcius. With his dying breaths, he gives Marcia his blessing to marry Juba, who he declares is a Numidian with a Roman soul, and Porcius the same to marry Lucia. Porcius curses the guilty world that takes Cato's life and leaves Caesar victorious, and he declares that the tragedy of Caesar's conquest will forever be a warning to all the nations of the dire cost of civil war. Thus, the end of the tragedy. Now, we look at the famous quotations taken from Cato and were inspired in American Revolution. Patrick Henry's famous ultimatum, "Give me liberty or give me death," and Nathan Hale's valediction, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," and Washington's praise for Benedict Arnold in a letter to him, It is not in the power of any man to command success, but you have done more and you have deserved it. Thanks for watching this video.